All right. Good evening again, and time for me to talk for a little bit. This is the week where we do this book, which is the Atthakavagga, the Book of Eights. So said because many of the selections from this actually have 8 verses, and this week's does indeed have 8 verses. This is the 5th of the 16 of these. It is called the Eightfold Discourse on the Ultimate. So as I usually do, I will read it through one time, then I will read it through more slowly, interspersing it with just reflections and thoughts and comments. And then I will stop recording and we will discuss it among ourselves. And then unfortunately we will adjourn. We will not be having tea and cookies tonight, although we may individually be doing that. All right, so here we go. Let me just read it. Having views about what is ultimate, a person makes these the best in the world and calls all other views inferior. As such, they have not gone beyond quarreling. Seeing benefit in the self, or in things seen, heard, and thought, or in precepts and religious practices, and then grasping at this, a person then sees all else as inferior. What one relies on in order to see all else as inferior is an entanglement, so those who are skilled. Monastics should therefore not depend on things seen, heard, or thought, or on virtue and religious observances, nor should they make up views in the world by means of knowledge, precepts, and religious observances. Nor should they think of themselves inferior or superior to others, and they shouldn't take themselves as equal. Letting go of what is taken up, the person free of grasping does not depend on knowledge or take sides when factions disagree or fall back on any kind of view. One not inclined to either side, to becoming or non-becoming, to here or the next world, there exists nothing to get entrenched in when considering the doctrines others grasp. Here one does not conceive the slightest concept in regard to what is seen, heard, or thought. How in this world could one categorize the Brahman who does not take hold of views? One does not construct, prefer, or take up any doctrine. A true Brahman is not led by precepts or religious practices, who has gone beyond, does not fall back on belief, is one who is thus. So this is actually one of my very favorite suttas in the whole of the canon. I love this one. A little bit of preamble before I go through it a second time. So first off, the time of the Buddha was a time of deep and rich philosophical debate. It's the time when the Upanishads were emerging, when the Sanatana Dharma, Brahmanism, Hinduism as we now know it, was being formed. It was really sort of distilling itself down from some earlier teachings. There was a lot of there's a lot of movement across countries. There were more, subsequent to this, Alexander the Great came into India, and you had the Greek influence in India. You had from India up the Silk Road, and Chinese people came down to India down the Silk Road. There's just an astonishing amount of mobility and cross-cultural influence going on. And actually, the emergence of the Sanatana Dharma was actually as a result of a population migrating into India, or into what we, the large area that includes what we now call India. So within that milieu, there were a lot of different philosophical and religious views. One of the things that is often misunderstood is people suggest that Buddha talked a lot about karma because he had to, because that's what people talked about. And there was just this concrete view that everybody believed karma worked this way. Well, they didn't. If you read the texts of the time, there are a whole bunch of different ways people understood karma worked. And so Buddha had to talk about it because he had to express his views on the topic, because that's what everybody did. I think it's the first sutta in the Digha Nikaya, which is the first of the collection in the Pali Canon, is the Brahmajala Sutta, which is it's Buddha repudiating 62 different views of existence, 62 different views of how the world works. Is it infinite? Is it finite? Do we exist? Do we not exist? Is there even time? I mean, there's they come up with 62 of these. So that's the environment that he was talking in. And what he's talking about here in terms of views are these philosophical views, these views of how the world works, who God is, what God is, whether there is a God, whether there's one or many. So it's kind of like an environment, Rome of the around the time of Christ was the same. I'm sorry, not Rome. Jerusalem was the same. There were any number of different views, and throughout the Roman Empire, there were just any number of views. And the Romans really didn't care what people believed; they cared how people behaved. But you had this cauldron of different views. So he was talking into this set of different views, and he was talking about those kinds of views. He wasn't talking about views about whether this is tasty curry or whether we like that shade of green in the trees. He was talking about these kind of philosophical views. Now you can expand this, and I think there's an interesting conversation when you expand what he's talking about and look at a broader array of views, but this is what he means by views. So having views about what is ultimate, as in the supreme truth, I got it, you don't. A person makes these, i.e. the views of what is ultimate, the best in the world. Christians think they've got the one true religion. Muslims think they've got the one true religion. Buddhists think we've got the one true religion. Makes it the best in the world and calls all other views inferior. And as such, they have not gone beyond quarreling. Boy, could we do with some of this today, right? Lots of quarreling about religions. Thus has it ever been. Seeing benefit in the self here is really just, it's an aggregation. It's a coming together of ideas. It becomes a self because that's what we make self out of. But what it's referring to here is we have these ideas and these views, and as we allow them to solidify, they solidify into a self. Or in things seen, heard, and thought. These are just the way that our various different truths are communicated, the way that we share these things. Or in precepts and religious practices, doctrines, beliefs, rituals, and then grasping at this. And the grasping is the making of this self. Grasping at these things, a person holds on to that and thinks just naturally, whether they're aware of it or not, the person holding on to views is going to naturally think other views are inferior. What one relies on in order to see all else as inferior is an entanglement. An entanglement is a phrase that shows up in the canon quite a bit, shows up a lot when talking about the dependent chain of origination. This is a tangled net. And it's a tangle, you can't get out of it, you're trapped. So if you create these collections of views, and here a view would simply be the truth of Buddhism, or the truth of the dependent chain of origination, the truth of the Four Noble Truths. Holding on to that becomes something we get stuck in. It's an entanglement. And therefore, as an entanglement, it's an encumbrance to freedom. Say those who are skilled. Those who are skilled are precisely those people who are well practiced and good at engaging in and talking about ways to reduce dukkha, ways to reduce suffering, ways to escape from the cycle of samsara, ways to get free. Monastics should therefore, by monastics, the word here is bhikkhu, which is translated as monastics, but at the time they were these mendicant followers of the Buddha's teachings. They just wandered all over. So they had no fixed abode, as most monastics do. Monastics should therefore not depend on this same list. They should not depend on things seen. There is nothing to depend on in something seen. They should not depend on things heard. Nothing to depend on in things heard. They should not depend on things thought out, on our ideas or other people's ideas. These things, all of these things, they're impermanent, they're insubstantial, or on virtue. It's not to say we don't practice virtue, but we don't depend on it. It's not to say we don't see the value in virtue for reducing suffering here and reducing suffering there, but we just don't depend on it. And on religious observances, relying on religious observances, on practices, on rituals is a challenge. Nor should they make up views in the world by means of the same list, knowledge, precepts, and religious observances. Nor should they think of themselves inferior or superior. So thinking of yourself as inferior is just as bad as thinking of yourself as superior. Setting up a self and another, there's an opposition here. There's a holding on to one side. And they shouldn't take themselves as equal. Because taking oneself as equal is, again, setting up two in opposition, setting up two, this is different from that. They're equal, but they're different. Equal as a judgment that's a measure. We're not inclined to either side, to becoming or non-becoming, to here or the next world. There exists nothing to get entrenched in when considering the doctrines others grasp. So this is the central teaching of Buddhism. Don't be inclined to either side. The middle path taught by the Tathagata is the path between the two extremes. It's not a compromise. It's not 50-50. It is simply avoiding the extremes. Going down the middle of the river and not touching either bank. Steering away from constructs of existence and away from constructs of non-existence. The Kaccayana Sutta, he says, this is what the Buddha taught. Avoiding these two, one extreme is existence, one extreme is non-existence. Avoiding these two extremes, I taught the middle path. And then he just recites the 12-link chain of dependent origination. From ignorance comes fabrication or intuition and so on, all the way up to becoming, birth, old age, and death. And then he does the 12-link chain in reverse. If there is no birth, there's no old age and death. If there's no becoming, there's no birth. If there's no clinging, there's no becoming, and so on, all the way down to if there's no ignorance, then none of this happens. So this, just this, is the teaching of the Buddha. This is freedom. This is where, and here's this verse again, there exists nothing to get entrenched in when considering the doctrines others grasp. And what I just talked about with the Buddha's teaching, he positions it not as a doctrine. He says, this is what I found. This works for me. Go try it. See for yourself. This is the path to freedom, but don't believe me. Go try it. And what it requires is simply letting go of views. All views. Here one does not conceive the slightest concept in regard to what is seen, heard, or thought. Any concept is a concept that leads towards existence or a concept that leads towards non-existence. We start forming a concept. A concept is a fabrication, which by definition is a leading into one of those two sides. It is falling away from the middle. How in this world could one categorize the Brahman who does not take hold of these? Think on that for a minute. How can you categorize somebody who does not have a view? There is nothing that sticks. This is the story out of the Vimalakirti Sutra. Vimalakirti Sutra, I think it is, where in the Hoja, the room, the flowers are raining down from the heavens, from the skies, and they're landing on the arhats who are trying to brush them off. They don't understand what's going on. And the bodhisattvas, who in that story are the more advanced beings, they don't land. They just slip off. Nothing sticks. So one who does not take hold of views, there is nothing that sticks. There's no way, nothing. And if nothing sticks, there is nothing by which we can identify them. No label can possibly land. And no label can possibly land makes sense, because what one is seeing is totally beyond description. It's not in this world or the next world. It is neither existent nor non-existent. It's an extraordinary thing. And that's the Buddha. The Buddha called himself Tathagata. Didn't talk of himself as the Buddha. He talked of himself as Tathagata, because it talks straight into this whole neither existent nor non-existent approach. It means thus come, thus gone. It's an intentionally ambiguous phrase. It doesn't really have a particular meaning. One does not construct, prefer, or take up any doctrine. A true Brahman, not led by precepts or religious practices, and it's not saying they don't practice precepts. Of course they do. They practice a life of virtue. But it's not one that comes out of intention. It's one that comes out of intuition, because in that place, to the extent there is a them, they are one with everything. It's the left hand, the right hand story, right? What would my left hand do if the right hand's hurt? Well, it helps it. It doesn't question it. So they don't construct, prefer, or take up any doctrine, but of course they behave in a completely harmless way in the world. And so not led by precepts or religious practices, but nonetheless appearing in this way. Who has gone beyond, does not fall back on belief. Once you've gone beyond, there's no falling back. Just can't happen. Is one who is thus. Thus is a word, I cannot remember the Sanskrit word, but it wouldn't help much. But there's a particular, it's like a 5 or 6 syllable framing of this, which is, it's talking about suchness, thusness, that this is something that neither exists nor does not exist. One who is thus.